we have seen the Russians failing to establish air cover. They were unable to use their bombers from early in the conflict to level Ukraine. And now what we're seeing on the ground is that not only do they not have the weapons, because they still have an advantage in artillery, they don't have the supply and logistics to move those weapons around effectively.
Well, in the Times this morning, they're reporting that there will be a virtual meeting of the G7 today. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has spoken to Prime Minister Liz Truss about further measures against President Putin. And on a message on the Telegram app, Zelensky has written, "We count on Great Britain's leadership in strengthening international political and defence support for Ukraine, in particular regarding the protection of our skies," which you heard Kira Ruddick talking about there. Let's get you some more analysis on the situation this morning with Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. Morning to you, Scott.
Good morning, Anna.
So was this President Vladimir Putin's revenge for the explosion that we saw happen on that bridge linking Crimea to Russia?
It is Vladimir Putin's desperation as he faces the defeat of his invasion of Ukraine after 7.5 months. The immediate cause that you cited was this very important strategic and symbolic blow, where the Kerch Bridge, which links Russian-occupied Crimea with the Russian mainland, 12-mile bridge was damaged severely by an explosion on Saturday, probably by Ukrainian sabotage. But the wider context is just this series of defeats that the Russians are suffering on the battlefield. Since the end of August, they have lost going on more than 10,000 square kilometers of territory in the east and in the south of the country. And it's not just the case that the Ukrainians are taking back territory that they lost earlier this year. They're now threatening territory that Russia has controlled since 2014, including those provinces that Vladimir Putin annexed last week. So for the first time, Putin is receiving domestic criticism directly. So it's not just criticism of his defense minister, Sergey Surovikin, not just criticism of his commanders, who he replaces, it seems, every few days. It was, why isn't Putin doing something? So, he lobs these missiles into Kyiv and more than 20 other cities yesterday, kills about at least 14 people. But the problem for Putin is this doesn't replace any type of battlefield success. So what happens the next time Ukraine gets another breakthrough?
We've heard talk, Scott, of a new Russian commander who is known for the actions that he has taken on other battlefields in Syria. Is this an indication of the measures that they're going to take, a new tactic?
Well, it's just a measure of Vladimir Putin's reaching out to someone and saying, all right, General, turn this war around and make it a victory for me and for Mother Russia. It just so happens that the latest general to be tapped, General Surovikin, is a particularly nasty piece of work, achieved notoriety in Russia in 1991 when there was an attempted coup by the military, and he drove a tank over protesters, killing 3 of them. But then he achieved much wider notoriety with overseeing devastating operations in Chechnya, and then for years in Syria, where he was the overall commander, where the Russians killed thousands, indeed tens of thousands of civilians, with just this carpet bombing of the cities that were held by the opposition. So this is a man who knows no limit in war. And it is a sign, if you want a sign here, that the idea of negotiating with Vladimir Putin, the idea that there's some type of off-ramp to settle this without further Russian attempts at bloodshed, no way. I mean, he's doubling down with the idea that it's not just Ukraine's military, but Ukraine's civilians that are going to have to be killed.
I'm wondering where this leaves the West. We have heard overnight from President Biden saying that he has promised he's going to continue to send help to Ukraine and Liz Truss has spoken to Vladimir Zelensky. What can the West do at the moment? This is a very difficult situation that has gone on for 7 months, but we know that NATO are not going to step foot inside Ukraine, are they?
No, so what you have to do is you have to help the Ukrainians initially resist Russia, and then, as we have seen over the last month, turn the tide of the conflict. So the specific steps are more of the same in terms of economic and financial aid. Ukraine needs about $5 billion a month to maintain basic services. A lot of that money, because Ukraine's under pressure, has to come from the international community. You provide more of the same when it comes to battlefield weapons. And the focus, as you have mentioned earlier today, will be on air defense systems. Ukraine also would want longer range missiles to strike Russian forces deeper in the areas that they hold in Ukraine. And Ukrainians would really like to have jet fighters, although they're not going to get those. But more broadly, the two words for not just the West, but the international community, just like Kyiv, stand firm. Vladimir Putin is going to try to break Ukrainian resistance by firing on civilians and killing them with impunity. I don't think that will break Ukrainian will. He will try to double down on this energy war against us and other countries and hope that it breaks our will to continue supporting Kyiv and that we'll walk away. And the question is, will he break us even as Ukraine continues to resist him?
I'm wondering, Scott, I think what surprised most people yesterday was the fact that these attacks that we saw, they happened in Russia, but they were not on military targets. They were very much landing on non-military targets. We know that one place that was hit was a university and another was a children's playground. Is this just indiscriminate from the Russians?
Well, sadly, it's not a surprise to me because the Russians have been doing this ever since the start of the war back in February. The tactics were never just to try to defeat Ukraine's military. It was to terrorize Ukraine's civilians. It was to disrupt their electricity, their heating. It was to deprive them of safe housing. It was to just batter them into submission. So a railway station in April in Kramatorsk, at least 57 killed. A theater in Mariupol in southern Ukraine, where up to 600 were killed back in the spring. A shopping mall in Kyiv, a school in Kharkiv. You know, Vladimir Putin's been firing missiles on Ukraine's civilians for 7.5 months. It's just that yesterday was a very vivid episode of this because they fired more than 80 of them. But it is also a marker, and I don't want to minimize the tragedy and the devastation of this. It's a marker that Ukraine's defenses, even as they exist right now without further help, were such that you had only about 14 people confirmed killed so far, compared to the hundreds that we have seen killed in other incidents that the Russians have carried out.
You mentioned earlier that we're hearing more criticism from within Russia of Vladimir Putin. How long do you think he's got?
Oh, I think he's still got some time because, you know, this is the man who has ruled Russia now for close to a quarter of a century. He has tried to close down dissent, not only amongst the general population, not only by killing off journalists, imprisoning activists, but also getting rid of rivals within the inner circle. That said, I think what's notable in this criticism is it's coming from a couple of important areas. The first is it's coming from military analysts. You'll sometimes hear them called mil bloggers. These are effectively people who are embedded with the Russian armed forces and have been since the start of the invasion. And they have never criticized Putin until the last few days. And now they're saying, look, we are losing. What's going to happen here? And he's receiving criticism on state television. It's implicit, but you have got commentators who supported him throughout who are saying, we thought this was going to be easy. Why are the Ukrainians fighting back? I think the risk here in the short term is not that Putin's going to be replaced. I think the risk is that these military analysts and these commentators on state TV are calling on Putin to wage even deadlier attacks like the kind that we did see yesterday. Fire more missiles in, fire everything we've got at Ukraine to somehow turn this around. which means that before Vladimir Putin's replaced, you'll see a desperate man get even more desperate, and we'll have the support of some desperate supporters who somehow want to wish up a victory out of what is going to be eventual defeat.
Do you think then, in that case, that what could possibly happen is he would take a sort of a scorched earth policy, as we saw in Syria?
Yeah, it's already happening. I mean, and again, just to give your listeners an idea of what happened in Syria, after the Russians intervened in 2015, for about the next 5 years, they leveled every part of that country that was not held by the Assad regime. And, they destroyed almost every medical facility in Aleppo, Syria's largest city. They destroyed most of the schools. They hit mosques. They hit almost every electrical and water station. And I think that is the same tactic that they're going to try to do in Ukraine, which is why, as important as it is to protect civilians, the other reason why Ukraine is saying is step up the air defenses is simply saying, look, let's make sure that the infrastructure can withstand these blows. There was a very big symbolic moment yesterday, Anna, which the Ukrainians pointed to, which is for all the devastation that Vladimir Putin waged, their bridge in Kyiv, their symbolic bridge, the Klitschko bridge, continues to stand, even as the Kerch bridge, Vladimir Putin's symbol between Crimea and Russia, collapsed a few days ago. They just want to make sure that that infrastructure continues to stand, that their shelters continue to hold, that they continue to have electricity and water, so that the Russians don't think that they can fire missiles and almost besiege them into submission.
Just before we let you go, Scott, we know that there's going to be a virtual meeting of the G7 today, but I was interested to see that there's also going to be a rare speech by the head of GCHQ, Sir Jeremy Fleming, who we expect to hear from him saying that Russia could run out of weapons and is suffering a staggering number of casualties, and will highlight how Kyiv's forces are turning the tide on both the battlefield and in cyberspace. So he's adding a note, by the sounds of it. I mean, we haven't heard this speech yet, but adding a note of hope for Ukrainians.
Yes, and we have already actually seen this with respect to Sir Jeremy as everyday observers, because the Russians at the start of this conflict were firing what you might call precision missiles, and they were hitting military targets with precision missiles. They don't have very many of those left, which is why they lob these missiles that are not so precise and they hit civilian targets. We have seen the Russians failing to establish air cover. They were unable to use their bombers from early in the conflict to level Ukraine. And now what we're seeing on the ground is that not only do they not have the weapons, because they still have an advantage in artillery, they don't have the supply and logistics to move those weapons around effectively. So when in the east, they lost more than 8,000 square kilometers of territory in a few days last month, it was because their forces were isolated, were cut off. When they lost more than 500 square kilometers in Kherson region in the south last week, it's because forces on one side of the Dnipro River are cut off from forces on the other side. So from the start of this war, they've really not been very effective in command and organization. And now the point here is they simply don't have that superiority of weapons or armaments, at least what you might call the high-tech weapons in key areas. But what Vladimir Zelensky is saying is, look, we've got winter coming on. We wouldn't, let's not let this drag on for months. Let's press the advantage. Let's get more military support in there where we finally, once and for all, can say to Vladimir Putin, look, your choice, my friend. You're not going to win this conflict. So can you halt it now, retreat back to Russia so that we limit the bloodshed, which has been occurring on both sides?
Always good to talk to you and get your analysis, Scott. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. That is Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin.